You seeing this garbage? Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane snapped, his voice cutting through the blistering Arizona heat like a whip crack. The steel target nearly 1,700 yards downrange stood untouched beneath the shimmering haze, mocking every Marine sniper on the firing line. Around him, expensive ballistic computers glowed with useless data, while spotting scopes tracked dust kicking harmlessly across the canyon floor. A young sniper cursed under his breath and cycled another round into the chamber. Mississippi. Again. The sharp clang they were waiting for never came. Only silence. Kane ripped his headset off and slammed it onto the shooting bench hard enough to rattle the brass casings scattered beside it. That's 12 straight misses, he barked. 12. At this point, I'd trust a blind deer hunter with a Walmart rifle more than this recon unit. No one answered. Sweat rolled down tense young faces beneath camouflage caps. Mirage waves danced violently above the rocks, twisting the distant target until it looked like it was floating in water. The wind flags along the range snapped in 3 different directions at once. Nothing made sense today. Every calculation contradicted the last. Every firing solution collapsed halfway to the target. Somewhere behind the firing line, a slow scraping sound drifted through the heat. Kane turned sharply. An old man in faded work jeans pushed a battered maintenance broom along the concrete edge near the range fence. Thin frame. White hair. Weathered skin burned dark from decades under the sun. He wore an old olive jacket despite the 100-degree heat, and his pale blue eyes weren't looking at the Marines. They were fixed on the wind, specifically the canyon walls beyond the target line. Kane stared at him in disbelief for a moment before scoffing. You gotta be kidding me. A few younger Marines turned and chuckled under their breath. The old man stopped sweeping but said nothing. Kane stepped toward him, boots crunching over gravel. This is an active force recon sniper qualification range, old-timer. You can't just wander around back here. The man's expression didn't change. He looked past Kane toward the distant target again, studying the heat shimmer rolling off the canyon rocks. Your bullet's dying halfway there, he said quietly. Several Marines laughed openly now. One corporal muttered, "What does that even mean?" Kane smirked and folded his arms. Appreciate the expert advice, Grandpa. But we've got kestrels, thermal data, live atmospheric tracking, and sniper school graduates on this line. The old man nodded once as if none of that impressed him. That's the problem. The answer landed wrong. Not aggressive. Not disrespectful. Worse. Calm. Certain. Kane felt irritation crawl up his neck. He had spent 15 years building a reputation inside Marine reconnaissance. Men listened when he spoke. They trusted his range calls in Afghanistan and Syria. And now some groundskeeper with a broom was standing in his range, acting like he understood wind drift better than trained snipers. A younger Marine near the spotting scope snorted. Maybe he fought at Gettysburg too. More laughter rolled down the line. The old man ignored every word. Slowly, deliberately, he set the broom aside near the fence. Then he looked toward the target again, eyes narrowing slightly at the dancing mirage above the canyon floor. You boys are reading surface wind, he said softly. The real wind's above the rocks. The range fell strangely quiet for half a second. Even the younger Marines stopped smiling. Because somewhere deep down, beneath the arrogance and electronics and modern training, every sniper on that firing line knew one thing. The old man was looking exactly where none of them had bothered to look. The heat pressed down on the firing range like a concrete slab. Somewhere far off in the canyon, dry wind hissed across stone and scrub brush, twisting the mirage until the target nearly vanished inside the shimmering air. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane stared at the old man for a long moment before letting out a short laugh through his nose. You telling me an 80-year-old janitor understands external ballistics better than Marine recon snipers? A few of the younger Marines chuckled immediately, eager to stay on the right side of the gunny's mood. Dean Walker did not react. He simply kept watching the canyon. The strange thing was his eyes never wandered. They tracked invisible movement across the rocks the same way experienced hunters watch tree lines before a storm. Lance Corporal Ethan Cole noticed it first. The old man was not guessing. He was measuring something. Kane stepped closer until he stood directly in front of him. Listen carefully, he said, voice low and edged with irritation. Those Marines behind me trained for years to be here. We have the best optics, best weather software, best ballistic computers on Earth. Dean nodded faintly, and every one of them missed. The words landed harder than Kane expected. A couple Marines stopped smirking. One sniper shifted awkwardly behind his rifle. The target downrange remained untouched beneath the brutal afternoon glare. Kane folded his arms tighter across his chest. "You got some kind of expert opinion, old-timer?" Dean finally looked at him directly. Pale blue eyes. Calm as cold steel. "Your bullets are climbing off the canyon wall about 1,100 yards out. Heat's pushing them upward before the crosswind rolls them left." One of the younger Marines laughed loudly. "That is impossible." Dean tilted his head slightly toward the canyon. "No," he said quietly. "It's happening right now." Kane shook his head in disbelief. "You know what I think?" He pointed toward the old maintenance broom leaning against the fence. "I think you got bored pushing that broom around and decided to come lecture Marines about long-range shooting." Dean said nothing. The silence irritated Kane more than an argument would have. A Marine corporal near the spotting scope leaned toward another sniper. "Guy probably watched a History Channel documentary and thinks he is Carlos Hathcock." More laughter rolled across the line. Dean ignored all of it. Slowly, deliberately, he crouched near an old canvas case resting beside the fence. The fabric looked ancient, faded from decades of sunlight and dust. He unsnapped the worn leather straps with steady hands. Ethan Cole felt something tighten in his stomach immediately. Whatever was inside that case mattered to the old man. Dean folded the canvas back carefully. Wood and blued steel appeared beneath the Arizona sun. The rifle looked old enough to belong in a museum. A walnut stock darkened with age. Scratches worn smooth by time. Metal polished soft from years of handling. It was an M40 bolt-action rifle from another era entirely. Several Marines burst into open laughter. "No way. That thing still fires? Holy hell, look at that relic." Kane smirked and walked closer, staring down at the rifle like it offended him personally. That antique cannot even compete with modern systems. Dean ran one weathered hand slowly along the rifle stock. His fingers stopped at a deep gouge near the receiver. The laughter around him faded into background noise. For the briefest moment, something changed in his expression. Not anger. Not pride. Memory. Ethan noticed it instantly. The old man was no longer standing on a clean Arizona firing range. Somehow, without saying a word, he looked like someone listening to ghosts. The desert wind rolled across the firing range in slow, uneven currents, carrying dust and the faint metallic smell of heated brass. No one laughed now. The old rifle resting across Dean Walker's hands had changed the atmosphere without a single word being spoken. Even Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane seemed unsure whether to mock it further or simply stare at it. The walnut stock was scarred from decades of hard use. The dark grain worn smooth where hands had carried it through places no rifle range could imitate. Sunlight caught the deep gouge near the receiver, and Dean's thumb rested against it with almost careful familiarity. "That thing belongs in a museum," Kane finally muttered. Dean's eyes stayed fixed on the gouge. Almost did once. The answer came so quietly several Marines did not hear it. Ethan Cole did. The young Lance Corporal felt the strange pressure in his chest grow heavier. Something about the old man no longer fit the image of a maintenance worker pushing a broom around base housing. It was the way he handled the rifle. Not carefully like an antique collector. Naturally, like part of his body. Kane crouched beside the rifle and shook his head. "You seriously expect me to believe this relic can outshoot modern Marine sniper systems?" Dean slowly worked the bolt open. The sound stopped conversations instantly. Clean. Smooth. Mechanical in a way modern rifles rarely sounded anymore. It was not the sharp metallic snap of factory precision. It was softer, broken in by years of use. The old man looked toward the canyon again. "Rifle is fine," he said. "Your shooters are fighting the terrain." Kane scoffed. "No, they are fighting wind drift." Dean gave a faint nod. "That too." One of the younger Marines leaned on his spotting scope. "You got all that from standing near a fence with a broom?" Dean looked toward the heat waves dancing above the canyon floor. "No," he said softly. "I got it from surviving places where missing mattered." The words settled over the firing line like dust. For a brief second nobody moved. Then Kane stood abruptly, irritation returning to his face. "You know what your problem is, old-timer? You think instinct beats training." Dean finally looked directly at him again. "No," he replied calmly. "I think experience teaches you what training forgets." Kane opened his mouth to answer, but Dean's fingers brushed the gouge on the rifle stock again. The desert disappeared. The hot Arizona air became thick jungle humidity pressing against young skins soaked with sweat and rain. The distant crack of target fire transformed into soft echoes rolling through endless green mountains. Dean was 19 again, lying motionless beneath dripping jungle leaves with the same rifle pressed against his shoulder. The gouge in the stock was fresh thin, splintered by flying metal after a mortar round struck the hillside nearby. Mud clung to his sleeves. Rainwater slid slowly down the rifle barrel. Somewhere beyond the trees, a machine gun position pinned down a Marine reconnaissance team trapped along a flooded ridgeline. He remembered watching leaves move in different directions at different heights. Remembered realizing the wind beneath the canopy was lying. The shot itself barely made a sound in his memory. Just a single squeeze of the trigger, followed by silence returning to the jungle. The kind of silence Marines prayed for. Dean blinked once, and the Arizona range returned around him. The canyon shimmered beneath the brutal afternoon sun. Kane was still standing there, arms crossed, waiting for an argument. But Dean Walker was no longer looking at him. His eyes had shifted upward toward the cliffs above the target line. Ethan followed his gaze. Then he saw it too. Tiny spirals of dust curling downward from the canyon wall high above the range. The upper wind was moving opposite the surface wind. The canyon wind shifted again. Not at ground level where the range flags fluttered uselessly in the heat, but higher above the rock walls where the invisible currents twisted through the cliffs like river water. Lance Corporal Ethan Cole stared upward, narrowing his eyes against the glare. Tiny spirals of dust drifted down from the canyon rim exactly where Dean Walker had been looking. His stomach tightened. "Gunny," Ethan said carefully. "The upper wind is reversing." Tyler Kane did not even turn around. "Surface wind controls the shot," he snapped. "That old man's got you seeing ghosts now." Dean rested the M40 gently across the shooting bench and looked back toward the target nearly a mile away. Heat shimmer rolled across the valley floor in violent waves. Even the steel silhouette looked distorted now, bending and twisting through the mirage. One of the Recon Marines settled behind his rifle again and adjusted his scope turrets. The young sniper exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself after 12 straight misses. Kane pointed sharply downrange. "Take the shot." Dean's voice came quietly from behind him. "Do not." The entire firing line froze. Kane turned slowly, disbelief spreading across his face. "Excuse me." Dean nodded toward the canyon walls. "Crosswinds building against the thermal rise. Bullet's going to drift hard left before it stabilizes." The young sniper behind the rifle glanced nervously between them. Kane stepped closer to Dean, jaw tightening. "You are standing on a United States Marine Corps sniper qualification range telling my recon unit how to shoot." Dean's expression never changed. "I am telling you your canyon is changing faster than your computers can track it." The words landed heavy in the dry desert air. Kane laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You know what I think?" He pointed toward the old rifle on the bench. "I think you got lucky making one observation, and now you want an audience." Dean slowly shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I just do not want your Marine learning the hard way." Kane's patience snapped. "That is enough." The force in his voice echoed off the canyon walls. "This is not Vietnam. This is not some jungle 70 years ago. We run precision data now." Dean looked toward the cliffs again. Terrain still does not care about computers. Ethan watched the exchange in growing silence. The old man never raised his voice. Never argued. Somehow that made the tension worse. Kane suddenly grabbed the M40 off the bench and held it up in front of the firing line. "Everybody look at this museum piece." A few Marines chuckled nervously. Kane pointed at the deep gouge near the receiver. "Probably older than half the buildings on this base." Dean's eyes locked onto the damaged wood instantly. For the first time all afternoon, something dangerous flickered behind the calm. Not anger. Memory. Kane noticed it and smirked. "What happened there?" he asked. "Drop it during the Civil War?" The younger Marines laughed harder now. But Ethan did not. Because the old man's face had gone completely still. Dean took one slow step forward and gently took the rifle back from Kane's hands. His fingers brushed across the gouge with almost painful care. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant. "Mortar fragment," he said softly. "Dak 2. 1967. The laughter died immediately. Wind hissed across the canyon rocks. Somewhere far downrange, Loose steel clinked faintly against its mount in the heat. Dean looked through the shimmering valley again, eyes narrowed with unsettling focus. Then he spoke without looking at anyone. If that Marine fires in the next 30 seconds, the bullet is going to ricochet off the canyon wall. Silence swallowed the range. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound on the firing line was the steady hiss of desert wind sliding across the canyon walls. The young recon sniper behind the rifle slowly lifted his face from the optic, uncertainty spreading across it. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane stared at Dean Walker with open disbelief. Then he laughed. Loud, sharp, forced. You expect me to shut down a live qualification range because some retired groundskeeper saw dust moving on a cliff? Dean never looked away from the canyon. Not dust, he replied quietly. Downdraft. Kane spread his arms toward the Marines around him. You hear this? A few nervous chuckles answered him, but not many this time. The mood on the range had changed. Too many missed shots. Too many strange wind shifts. Too much certainty in the old man's voice. Ethan Cole looked back toward the canyon rim again. The upper air currents were definitely moving differently now. He could see it clearly. Heat waves twisted sideways near the rocks before rolling downward into the valley. The firing solution on the ballistic tablet suddenly looked less reliable than it had 10 minutes earlier. Kane pointed toward the Marine behind the rifle. Shooter ready? The young sniper hesitated. Gunny, maybe we should recalculate. Kane's jaw tightened instantly. You already did 3 recalculations. Dean finally turned away from the canyon and looked directly at the young Marine. His voice stayed calm. Son, if you fire right now, the bullet is going to strike left canyon rock before it stabilizes. The Marine swallowed hard. Kane stepped between them immediately. Enough. The word cracked across the firing line like a snapped cable. You do not get inside my Marines' heads. Dean nodded once as if he understood perfectly. Then stop asking them to trust bad air. Kane took another step closer until the two men stood only a few feet apart. One young and rigid with authority. The other old and perfectly still. You know what your problem is? Kane said quietly. You think stories matter more than discipline. Dean looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, he said softly. I think discipline keeps men alive long enough to gain experience. Ethan felt the tension tighten across the entire range. Nobody touched their rifles now. Even the spotters had lowered their binoculars. Somewhere overhead, a hawk circled above the canyon thermals, barely moving its wings. Dean glanced at it briefly, then back toward the target line. It is changing again, he murmured. Kane threw his hands up in frustration. Fine. He turned toward the shooter. Send it. The young Marine hesitated one final second before settling behind the rifle. His breathing slowed. Crosshairs steadied. Finger tightened carefully against the trigger. Ethan held his breath without realizing it. Dean Walker never moved. The rifle cracked across the canyon. The bullet vanished into the heat shimmer. For half a heartbeat, everything seemed normal. Then a sharp metallic snap echoed from somewhere far left of the target line. Not the steel silhouette. Rock. The entire firing line jerked toward the canyon wall. A second later, the actual target remained untouched in the distance. Silence crashed over the range. The young sniper slowly lifted his face from the optic, eyes wide with disbelief. Kane's expression hardened instantly. Lucky guess, he said, but the confidence was gone now. Dean's pale blue eyes remained fixed on the canyon. No, he replied quietly. That wind announced itself 30 seconds ago. Ethan stared at the old man in stunned silence. Then his eyes drifted toward the M40 resting on the bench beside him. Something deep in the back of his memory suddenly clicked into place. He had seen that rifle before. Not in person. In photographs. The silence after the missed shot felt heavier than the desert heat itself. No one on the firing line spoke. The sharp crack of the bullet striking canyon rock still echoed faintly through the valley, bouncing between cliffs like a warning nobody wanted to acknowledge. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane stood rigid beside the shooting bench, jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. Across from him, Dean Walker remained completely calm. The old Marine simply watched the wind move through the canyon as if the entire exchange had already happened long before anyone else noticed it. Ethan Cole could not stop staring at the M40 resting on the bench. His pulse had started climbing the second he saw the gouge in the rifle stock. Now the feeling was worse. Familiarity. Not with the man. With the weapon. Somewhere deep in the back of his memory, buried beneath months of weapons maintenance and endless range instruction, he had seen that rifle before. Kane finally broke the silence. Everybody reset. His voice lacked its earlier confidence. Recalculate dope and get ready for another round. Nobody moved immediately. The Recon Marines glanced uneasily toward Dean before returning to their rifles. Ethan slowly crouched near the old M40, pretending to check brass near the bench while his eyes drifted toward the faded serial engraving near the receiver. The moment he saw the numbers, his stomach dropped. He knew that serial sequence. Not from a database. From the wall inside the Quantico Sniper School armory. Ethan stood abruptly. Dean noticed the reaction instantly, but said nothing. Kane was too distracted barking corrections at the shooters to pay attention. Ethan stepped backward toward the equipment tent, heartbeat pounding in his ears. Inside the shaded tent, the air smelled like canvas, CLP oil, and overheated electronics. He grabbed a ruggedized tablet from the supply table and pulled up archived Marine Corps weapons records with shaking fingers. The serial number appeared almost immediately. Ethan froze. The screen displayed a faded black-and-white photograph beneath the registry file. Young Marines standing in jungle fatigues beside a helicopter landing zone somewhere in Vietnam. One of them held the exact same rifle. Lean, hard-eyed, barely older than 20. The name beneath the image made Ethan's throat tighten. Gunnery Sergeant Dean Walker. Recon Scout Sniper. Confirmed Extreme Range Engagement Specialist. Status: retired. Additional records restricted by command authority. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. He had heard instructors mention the name once during advanced range theory. Walker's Vietnam Canyon shot had become almost mythological among Marine sniper schools because nobody fully understood how he made the wind correction without modern equipment. Ethan slowly looked back toward the firing line through the tent opening. The old man was standing exactly where he had been before, hands resting lightly on the worn M40. Calm, silent, almost invisible if someone did not know what they were seeing. Kane marched toward Dean again, frustration boiling harder now that his authority had cracks in it. "You got lucky once," he snapped. "That does not make you some legend." Dean tilted his head slightly. "Never said I was." The answer only made Kane angrier. Ethan swallowed hard and reached for his phone. His thumb hovered uncertainly above the contact list before stopping on one name. Master Gunnery Sergeant Nolan Pierce. Quantico Armory Division. Ethan hit call. The line clicked twice before a rough, older voice answered. "Pierce." Ethan lowered his voice immediately. "Master Guns, this is Lance Corporal Ethan Cole at Black Ridge Range. I think Dean Walker is standing on our firing line." Silence. Complete silence. Then the older Marine's voice returned, suddenly sharp and alert. "Tell me exactly what rifle he is carrying." Ethan looked out toward the bench again. Old M40. Walnut stock. Deep gouge near the receiver. Another silence. Longer this time. When Pierce finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "Dear God," he whispered. "Walker is still alive." The wind intensified across Black Ridge Range, rolling through the canyon in strange, uneven pulses that made the hanging range flags twitch like nervous hands. Far overhead, the circling hawk drifted effortlessly through the thermals while every Marine on the firing line fought conditions they no longer trusted. Ethan Cole lowered the phone slowly from his ear, heart pounding hard enough he could feel it in his throat. Master Gunnery Sergeant Pierce had not sounded surprised. He had sounded afraid. Ethan looked back toward Dean Walker, standing quietly beside the old M40. The old sniper had returned to silence after the phone call interruption, eyes fixed once again on the canyon walls as if reading a language nobody else could understand. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane paced near the shooting benches, frustration radiating off him in waves. Every failed shot was eroding control of his range, and now the younger Marines were watching Dean more closely than their own instructor. King could feel it happening. Respect shifting away from rank toward competence. It infuriated him. "Another shooter up," he ordered sharply. One of the Recon Marines stepped forward uncertainly and settled behind his rifle. His confidence was already damaged by the earlier ricochet. Dean glanced toward the canyon and immediately frowned. "No," Kane spun toward him instantly. "You do not give commands on my firing line." Dean ignored the anger completely. Upper thermal just collapsed. Ethan looked upward automatically. The heat shimmer above the canyon cliffs had changed shape again, flattening into unstable waves that rolled sideways through the rocks. Even from hundreds of yards away, the air looked wrong. Dean pointed quietly toward the left canyon wall. The wind is about to reverse through the cut. Kane folded his arms tightly. You keep predicting disasters long enough, and eventually one lands. Dean nodded slightly. Usually because nobody listens. The Marine behind the rifle hesitated visibly now. Sweat rolled down the side of his face beneath the desert sun. Kane noticed it immediately. Take the shot, he ordered. The young sniper tightened against the stock, but never fired. Dean stepped slowly toward the firing line, gaze fixed on the canyon. 3 seconds, he said quietly. Kane scoffed. What is that supposed to mean? Dean never answered. Somewhere deep within the canyon, a sudden gust exploded through the rock cut like a furnace blast. Dust spiraled violently across the valley floor. The hanging wind flag snapped in the complete opposite direction all at once. Several Marines cursed in shock. The sniper behind the rifle jerked backward instinctively before he could fire. Silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. Dean looked toward Kane calmly. That was the reversal. Nobody laughed this time. Ethan watched several Recon Marines exchange uneasy looks. One of them slowly lowered his expensive ballistic tablet, as if embarrassed by it. Kane's face hardened further, but the certainty behind his posture had started cracking. Before he could speak again, a distant sound rolled across the desert sky. Rotor blades. Every head turned upward instinctively. A dark military helicopter appeared beyond the canyon ridge, descending fast toward the range. Dust swirled violently beneath it as the aircraft angled toward the nearby operations pad. Ethan's stomach dropped immediately. Nobody scheduled command visits to Black Ridge without warning. Kane frowned toward the helicopter. What the hell now? Dean never reacted. He simply rested one hand lightly against the worn M40 stock. The helicopter settled onto the landing pad with a roar of hot wind and dust. Marines shielded their eyes as the side door opened. A tall officer stepped out wearing desert utilities marked with the star insignia of a major general. The moment Ethan recognized him, his pulse spiked again. Major General Robert Holloway, commanding officer of Marine Advanced Reconnaissance Training. Kane straightened instantly and snapped to attention in confusion. General on deck. The entire firing line locked upright. But the general was not looking at the Marines. The second his eyes landed on Dean Walker beside the old M40, his entire expression changed. The helicopter rotors slowed into a heavy rhythmic thump that rolled across Black Ridge Range like distant artillery. Dust drifted through the hot desert air as Major General Robert Holloway stepped away from the aircraft and strode toward the firing line with sharp, purposeful steps. Every Marine stood rigid at attention. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane's voice cut across the range automatically. Black Ridge Recon Unit, standing by, sir. The general never acknowledged him. His eyes stayed locked on Dean Walker the entire time. The closer he came, the quieter the range became. Even the wind seemed to ease for a moment. Dean rested one hand against the old M40 and watched the general approach without changing expression. No salute. No surprise. Just the same calm stillness he had carried all afternoon. Holloway stopped several feet in front of him. For one long second, neither man spoke. Then the general looked down at the rifle, specifically the deep gouge near the receiver. His jaw tightened visibly. I have not seen that rifle in 30 years, he said quietly. Nobody on the range moved. Kane glanced between them in growing confusion. Sir. Holloway ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Dean Walker. Master Gunnery Sergeant Pierce called me 10 minutes ago, he said. Said Black Ridge had a ghost standing on the firing line. Dean gave the faintest shrug. Pierce always did exaggerate. A few Marines exchanged stunned looks. The general actually smiled at that. Small, brief, respectful. Then he turned toward the firing line. Every sniper on this range knows about the DAC to Canyon Correction shot, he said. Most of them think it is a myth. Ethan Cole felt chills run down his arms despite the heat. Kane stared at Dean in disbelief. Sir, this man was at DAC too? Holloway looked back toward him sharply. This man rewrote Marine Corps long-range engagement theory before your instructors were born. Silence crashed over the range again. Dean looked mildly uncomfortable now, as if he disliked every second of the attention. Holloway noticed immediately. Still hates being talked about. the general muttered quietly. Kane's confidence was visibly collapsing. The younger Marines no longer looked at Dean like a maintenance worker. They looked at him the way Marines looked at combat legends whose names survived long after retirement. Holloway glanced toward the untouched steel target nearly 1,700 yards away. Heat shimmer still danced violently across the canyon. "You called the wind reversal before it happened?" he asked Dean. Dean nodded once. Thermals were stacking against the cliff face. Holloway slowly smiled again. "Just like Dactu." Kane finally found his voice. "Sir, with respect, nobody can consistently read upper canyon wind without live atmospheric tracking." Dean answered before Holloway could. "You can if you stop staring at the computer." A few Marines lowered their eyes immediately. The words hit harder, now coming from someone the general clearly respected. Holloway looked toward the firing mat. "Can you still do it?" Dean stared downrange silently. The canyon wind rolled through the cliffs again, shifting the mirage in slow boiling waves. For a moment, he looked very old beneath the desert sun. Then his pale blue eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the drifting thermals. "Wind is cleaner now," he murmured. Holloway stepped aside without another word. Nobody ordered it. Nobody announced it. But every Marine on the firing line instinctively moved out of Dean Walker's path. The old sniper lifted the worn M40 carefully and walked toward the firing position with slow, deliberate steps. Brass crunched softly beneath his boots. No ballistic tablet. No spotter. No wind meter. He settled onto the mat like a man returning to a familiar place after a lifetime away from it. The entire range watched in complete silence as Dean eased the old rifle against his shoulder and looked through the scope. Then, for the first time all afternoon, Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane realized his hands were shaking. The desert range went completely still. Even the younger Marines who had mocked Dean Walker earlier now stood silent beneath the brutal Arizona sun, watching the old sniper settle behind the worn M40 like a man stepping back into a life he had never truly left. Heat shimmer rolled across the canyon in violent waves, bending the distant steel target until it barely looked real. 1,700 yards away, the silhouette flickered inside the mirage like a ghost standing in the desert. Dean rested his cheek lightly against the old walnut stock. His breathing slowed almost immediately. Calm, controlled, familiar. The same rifle that had crossed jungles, mountains, and forgotten valleys decades earlier now pointed downrange once again. Major General Robert Holloway stood quietly behind the firing line with his arms folded, eyes fixed on Dean with unmistakable respect. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared interrupt. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane remained frozen near the benches, the confidence stripped from his face. For the first time all afternoon, he looked less like an instructor and more like a student watching something he could not fully understand. Dean never touched a ballistic calculator, never checked a wind meter. Instead, his pale blue eyes studied the canyon itself, the drifting dust, the trembling heat waves above the rocks, the circling hawk riding invisible thermals high overhead. Tiny details nobody else had noticed until he arrived. Ethan Cole realized then that Dean was not calculating the wind. He was listening to it. Dean's fingers settled gently against the trigger. The firing line collectively held its breath. Then the old M40 cracked across the desert. The sound echoed through the canyon walls sharp and clean before dissolving into silence. The bullet vanished into the shimmering air. 1 second. 2. 3. Then the distant steel target rang out across Black Ridge Range with a hard metallic clang, so clear it sounded unreal. Nobody moved. The sound rolled through the canyon and came back again like an answer from the desert itself. One of the Recon Marines slowly lowered his spotting scope in disbelief. Another simply stared at the target with his mouth slightly open. Ethan felt chills race down his arms despite the 100-degree heat. Dean Walker calmly lifted his face from the rifle scope as if the shot meant nothing at all. But the range had changed completely now. The old sniper had not just hit the target. He had threaded a bullet through unstable canyon thermals and opposing wind currents that had defeated every modern firing solution on the range. Holloway slowly stepped forward, eyes still fixed on the steel target in the distance. "Same correction," he murmured quietly. "After all these years." Dean rested one weathered hand against the rifle stock. "Wind still moves the same," he replied softly. No one laughed anymore. No one smirked. The arrogance had disappeared from the firing line entirely. Gunnery Sergeant Tyler Kane stared at the old Marine for several long seconds before finally stepping forward. His face had gone pale beneath the desert sun. "Sir." The word caught in his throat awkwardly. Dean looked up at him calmly. Kane swallowed hard. "I did not know who you were." Dean's expression never changed. "You were not supposed to." The answer hit harder than any lecture could have. Holloway turned slowly toward the Recon Marines, standing motionless beside their rifles. "Every one of you remembers this moment," the general said quietly. "Technology matters. Training matters. But experience written in blood and time matters too." The wind rolled softly through the canyon once more, gentler now beneath the fading afternoon sun. Dean Walker picked up the old M40 and began walking back toward the maintenance fence where his broom still leaned against the concrete. No dramatic speech. No celebration. Just an old Marine returning to silence. Behind him, every recon sniper on Black Ridge Range stood watching with the same expression. Respect. And somewhere high above the canyon cliffs, the hawk continued circling effortlessly through the invisible wind. Dean had understood all along. Some men stop fighting wars. Others simply learn how to hear the world more clearly afterward.